Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now before I begin, tell me where you are watching from. I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. That day began like any other, yet somehow the air carried a heaviness I couldn't shake. The sun hung low, casting a honey-colored light through the living room curtains, and I remember the faint hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. Life has a way of slipping into routine so quietly that you almost stop noticing it, but then something happens. A glance, a word, a pause that makes you realize nothing will ever feel the same again. That was the day my son looked at me differently. He had grown into a man before my very eyes, though I still caught glimpses of the boy who used to run barefoot in the backyard, chasing after fireflies in the long summer evenings. To me, he was always both, my child, and yet someone becoming entirely his own person. That afternoon, he walked into the room carrying a stack of old photo albums he had found tucked away in the attic. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his hair falling just the way it used to when he refused to cut it as a teenager, and there was a seriousness about him that startled me. "Mom," he said, his voice lower, steadier than I was used to hearing, "I want to look through these with you." It wasn't just the request, it was the way he looked at me when he said it. His eyes lingered on mine with a weight that told me he wasn't just talking about photographs. He was reaching for something deeper, something unspoken between us. We sat together on the couch, and as he opened the first album, the sound of the plastic pages crackling echoed in the quiet room. Pictures of birthdays, school plays, and family trips spilled across the pages. I laughed at the sight of his gap-toothed grin, his awkward middle school haircut, the way his father used to stand stiffly in photos, never knowing how to smile naturally. My son chuckled along, but every so often I caught him watching me instead of the pictures. There was a moment when he brushed his hand over an old photograph of us at the beach. He was no older than 8 then, perched on my shoulders with his arms spread wide like he was flying. His fingers lingered on that image, and then he looked at me again. It wasn't the look of a boy seeking comfort. It was the gaze of a man seeing me as someone more than just his mother. It unsettled me at first. My instinct was to break eye contact, to retreat into small talk, to keep the safe distance that time and roles had carved between us. But something inside me told me not to. I held his gaze, and in that silence, I felt years of unspoken understanding pass between us. He was telling me without words that he saw me, my struggles, my sacrifices, my flaws, and my quiet strength. The room seemed to shrink around us, the sound of the refrigerator fading, the golden light softening. It was just the two of us in that moment, sharing something so delicate it almost frightened me. I realized then how easily we overlook the way our children come to know us, not just as caretakers or protectors, but as people. He wasn't looking for guidance or answers anymore. He was offering me something instead: respect, recognition, maybe even forgiveness for the times I hadn't gotten it right. I smiled at him, my throat tight with words I couldn't quite form. He smiled back, and it was different than before. Warmer, more certain. And though nothing dramatic was said, something within me shifted. I knew that day marked a turning point, not in the sense of losing him, but in gaining him back in a new way. As the evening settled, and we closed the last album, I found myself grateful for the silence between us, for the way it spoke louder than any confession could. He leaned back into the couch, his arms stretched casually along the top, and for the first time, I didn't just see my son. I saw a man who had chosen to truly see me too. That was the beginning of everything changing, though neither of us said it out loud. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, though I wasn't sure if it was the quiet dawn light slipping into the room or the lingering thoughts from the night before that pulled me from sleep. The memory of the way my son had looked at me still pressed heavily on my heart. It wasn't just a fleeting glance. It was as though he had discovered something about me, something I wasn't sure I had ever shown him before. I padded into the kitchen, barefoot, the tiles cool against my skin, and started the coffee pot. The house was still, save for the distant sound of birds outside, their voices carrying through the open window. I tried to busy myself with simple routines, measuring coffee grounds, rinsing dishes left from the night before, but my mind kept circling back to him. My boy, who was no longer a boy. My son, who now carried himself with a presence I couldn't quite place. When he finally came downstairs, his hair still tousled from sleep, he smiled at me in a way that stopped me mid-motion. Not the quick, distracted smile he used to give when rushing out the door, but one that lingered, one that seemed to study me. He pulled out a chair at the table and sat down, folding his arms, waiting as though he wanted me to start the conversation. "You were quiet last night," he said after a moment, his voice calm but steady. "Did I say something to unsettle you?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that for years I had been answering his questions quickly, lightly, always keeping things on the surface. But this time, something inside me told me not to hide. "No," I replied softly. "It wasn't what you said. It was the way you looked at me." His eyes didn't flinch. "Because I wanted you to know I see you. Not just as my mom, but as you." Those words, simple as they were, struck a chord deep within me. For so long, I had played the role of caretaker, of the one holding everything together, that I had almost forgotten I was someone beyond those duties. To hear him say that, to feel that recognition from my own son, filled me with a warmth I hadn't realized I was missing. We sat in silence for a few moments, the steam curling up from our coffee mugs. The kitchen light painted his face in soft gold, and I could see the faint lines of responsibility beginning to mark his features, reminders that time was moving faster than I liked to admit. Then he began to share pieces of himself I hadn't heard before, his doubts, his fears, the times he questioned if he was on the right path in life. He spoke with honesty, with vulnerability, and I felt something open between us. It wasn't the usual exchange of advice or encouragement I had always tried to give. Instead, it was a meeting of equals, of two people laying down their guard for the first time. As he spoke, I realized how often I had underestimated him. I had thought of him as someone still learning, still needing my guidance, when in truth, he was guiding me just as much now. He was teaching me how to let go, how to see him as the man he had become without clinging too tightly to the child he once was. I reached across the table, placing my hand over his. It was larger than mine now, firm and steady, but when he turned his palm to hold mine, I felt the same thread of connection that had bound us since the moment I first held him as a newborn. Only now, it carried a different strength, one rooted not in dependence, but in mutual respect. The day stretched on quietly after that. We worked side by side in the garden, pulling weeds, planting bulbs, the sun warming our shoulders. Every so often he would glance at me, and each time I felt that same shift in my heart. I wasn't losing him to adulthood, as I had once feared. Instead, I was gaining something more profound, a relationship built on honesty, recognition, and trust. That evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sky turn shades of pink and purple, he leaned back in his chair and said, "I think we're both learning each other all over again." And he was right. That was exactly what it felt like, an unfolding, a rediscovery, a quiet truth settling between us that would shape everything that came next. The following days unfolded with a quiet rhythm, though everything felt different beneath the surface. I noticed small things I might have once overlooked, the way my son lingered in conversation, the thoughtful pauses he took before responding, the way his gaze would soften when I spoke about memories of the past. It was as though the shift that began that evening with the photo albums had continued to ripple through every moment we now shared. One afternoon, rain tapped steadily against the windows, filling the house with that familiar, calming rhythm. We decided to stay in, just the two of us, making soup together in the kitchen. The scent of simmering onions and herbs filled the air, wrapping us in comfort. I stood at the counter chopping carrots while he stirred the pot, and for a moment I caught myself watching him the way he had been watching me, studying the details, noticing how his shoulders had broadened, how his hands moved with quiet confidence. He must have sensed my gaze because he set the wooden spoon down and looked at me with a half-smile. "What?" he asked, his tone playful but tinged with curiosity. I shook my head lightly, smiling back. "Nothing. Just, I forget sometimes how grown you are. Then I look at you and it hits me all over again." His expression softened, and he leaned against the counter. "I know what you mean. Sometimes when I look at you, I see more than I ever let myself before. It makes me wonder how many things I missed when I was younger." The words sank deep, and I felt an ache in my chest. For years, I had hidden so many parts of myself behind the role of being his mother, my disappointments, my quiet longings, the times I stumbled. I had wanted to protect him from seeing me as anything less than strong. But now he was inviting me to show him who I really was, and that invitation felt like a gift I wasn't sure I deserved. I decided to take a step I had never taken before. Setting the knife aside, I dried my hands and sat down at the kitchen table. "You know," I began, my voice quieter than I expected, "I wasn't always sure I was doing things right. Raising you, keeping the house, making ends meet, it wasn't easy. There were nights I'd cry after you were asleep, wondering if I was failing you." He sat across from me, leaning forward, listening with a stillness that reminded me of his father in rare moments of patience. But unlike his father, my son's silence wasn't distant. It was present, engaged, filled with empathy. "You didn't fail me," he said firmly, his voice low but certain. "You gave me everything I needed. Even when you doubted yourself, you were giving me strength." Tears pricked my eyes, and I tried to blink them away. It wasn't easy for me to let down the walls I had built for decades, but in that moment I felt them crumbling. "Hearing you say that means more than you know," I whispered. We let the soup simmer as we talked, and for the first time in years, I told him stories about my own youth, the dreams I once had, the mistakes I made, the lessons I carried. He listened without judgment, without impatience, almost as if he was collecting pieces of me he had never known existed. Later, we sat on the couch with steaming bowls of soup, the rain still whispering against the windows. He turned to me suddenly and said, "I think part of why I look at you differently now is because I finally see the person behind the mother. And I like what I see." The words struck me with such tenderness that I couldn't speak right away. Instead, I reached out and touched his hand, letting my silence say everything my voice could not. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized how deeply this change had rooted itself. It wasn't just about him seeing me differently. It was about me allowing myself to be seen. For so long, I had been defined by what I did for others, but now, through his eyes, I was rediscovering the woman I had almost forgotten I was. And with that realization came a quiet, powerful truth. This was not an ending, but a beginning. A chance to know each other and myself in ways that would reshape everything we shared from here forward. The season was shifting by the time I fully understood what had changed between us. The leaves outside the window had begun to turn, their edges tinged with amber and gold, and the air carried a crispness that made the evenings feel quieter, more thoughtful. Change was everywhere, not only in nature but within the walls of our home, within the spaces of silence and conversation that now bound us more closely than ever before. One evening, we sat together on the porch as the sun slipped beneath the horizon. The sky was brushed with strokes of orange and lavender, and the crickets had begun their nightly song. My son leaned back in his chair, his face half lit by the fading light, and he said something that stayed with me. "You know, Mom, I think seeing you for who you really are has changed how I see myself, too." I turned to him, my breath catching for a moment. "What do you mean?" He paused as though gathering his words carefully. "All my life I thought of you as unshakable. like you never doubted, never faltered. But now that I know you carried doubts, fears, even regrets, and still found the strength to raise me, to keep going, it makes me realize I don't have to be perfect to be strong. I can be human and still be enough." Those words were a mirror, reflecting back to me the very lessons I had longed for him to learn. And yet, hearing him say them aloud, I felt a rush of gratitude and humility. It was proof that even in my quiet stumbles, even in the nights I thought I had failed, I had given him something that mattered. We sat in that stillness for a long time, watching the shadows lengthen across the yard. I thought about all the years that had passed, all the moments I had worried would define me in his eyes. And yet here we were, not defined by mistakes, but connected through the honesty of finally showing ourselves to one another. The days that followed carried this new rhythm forward. We spoke openly about things we once avoided, about his father, about the paths not taken, about the quiet hopes I still held for myself even at my age. He didn't shy away or change the subject. He leaned in, wanting to know me not as a perfect figure, but as a woman still learning, still living. And I, in turn, began to see him in the fullness of who he had become, not only as my son, but as a man with wisdom, compassion, and a strength uniquely his own. There was no distance between us anymore, no unspoken wall of roles. Instead, there was an understanding that ran deeper than either of us had expected. One night, as I tucked away the last of the photo albums we had left scattered on the coffee table, he stalked me with a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Mom," he said quietly, "thank you for letting me see you. It's changed everything." I met his eyes, and in them I saw not only the boy I had raised, but the man who now stood as my equal. My heart swelled with a mix of pride and peace. "And thank you," I whispered back, "for looking closely enough to find me." As I lay in bed later, the house quiet around me, I realized how rare such moments are, those turning points that arrive without fanfare, without dramatic declarations, but alter everything that follows. That day when my son first looked at me differently, I hadn't known what it meant. But now, with the gift of time and words, I understood. It meant I was no longer just the one who carried him. I was also someone he chose to walk beside. And in that truth, I found a new kind of freedom, a new kind of love. It wasn't about holding on anymore. It was about being seen, being known, and learning that change, even the quiet kind, can be the most beautiful gift of all.